She swore she'd never marry a duke he forgot to mention he was one, until the ball. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, as all terrible things did. Arabella Thorne stood at the window of the cramped parlour, watching rain streak down glass that hadn't been properly cleaned in a fortnight. Mrs. Hendricks, their sole remaining servant, being too elderly and too proud to accept help with tasks she'd once performed with ease. The letter trembled slightly in Arabella's hand, though she had already read it 3 times and committed its contents to the particular corner of her mind where she stored unpleasant necessities. "Well?" Her mother's voice cut through the drumming of rain. "Don't keep us in suspense, Arabella. What does Cousin Harriet say?" Arabella turned from the window, composing her features into the pleasant neutrality she had perfected over years of delivering bad news. Her mother sat in the best chair, the only chair whose stuffing hadn't begun, migrating through worn upholstery, with the perpetual expression of aggrieved disappointment that had become her default countenance since Papa's death. Beside her, Catherine perched on the settee with ill-concealed impatience, while Violet curled in the corner with a book she was only pretending to read. "Cousin Harriet writes to extend an invitation," Arabella said carefully. "She requests our company for the summer at Hartwell Manor. She says the country air will do us good, and that she has room enough for all of us." What Cousin Harriet had actually written was considerably less generous in tone. The invitation came wrapped in layers of obligation and condescension, reminding them, as if they needed reminding, that the Thorne family's reduced circumstances were entirely of their own making, and that Harriet's willingness to house them for the summer was an act of Christian charity that ought to be received with appropriate gratitude and humility. But Arabella had long ago learned to translate such letters for her family's consumption. Some truths served no purpose but to wound. "The country!" Catherine's face lit with an enthusiasm that made her look younger than her 20 years, erasing for a moment the sharp hunger that had settled into her features over the past difficult years. "Does she say anything about society? About the neighbourhood? Surely there must be assemblies, or at least dinner parties." "Hartwell is near the village of Thornwood," Arabella said. "I don't know what society the area offers." "Thornwood?" Their mother straightened in her chair, a rare spark of interest piercing her habitual malaise. "But isn't that near the Duke of Thornwood's estate? I'm certain I've heard the name. Yes, the Ashworth family. Very old, very distinguished. The current Duke is unmarried, I believe." Arabella suppressed a sigh. She should have known her mother would immediately calculate the matrimonial possibilities. Mrs. Thorne, having married a baron and lived to regret it spectacularly, remained, nonetheless convinced that an advantageous match was the solution to every problem, preferably a match that would restore the family to the comfort and status they had once enjoyed and lost. "I very much doubt," Arabella said dryly, "that the Duke of Thornwood will take any notice of a family of impoverished relations staying with our equally impoverished cousin. And even if he did, I cannot imagine what good it would do us. Dukes do not marry penniless nobodies, Mamma." "One never knows," her mother said, with the vague optimism of a woman who had spent 25 years ignoring reality. "Catherine is quite pretty when she makes an effort. And you, Arabella, could be handsome enough if I would only smile more, speak less, and develop an entirely different personality." Arabella raised an eyebrow. "I think we've established that such a transformation is beyond my capabilities." Catherine giggled, then quickly smothered it when their mother shot her a quelling look. Violet didn't look up from her book, but her lips twitched. "You might at least try," Mrs. Thorne said, with the particular martyred tone she reserved for Arabella's many failures. "Your father's title may be gone, but you are still Baron Thorne's daughters. There is no reason you could not make respectable matches, if you would only apply yourselves." There were, in fact, numerous reasons, starting with their complete lack of dowry and ending with their father's spectacular public disgrace. But Arabella saw no point in rehearsing facts her mother preferred not to acknowledge. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. "Cousin Harriet expects us by the end of the month. We should begin preparations." What preparations they could make, at any rate. Their wardrobes were pitifully thin, their trunks held more patches than original fabric, and their mother's collection of jewellery had long since been sold to pay creditors. But Arabella had become expert at making much from little. She would remake her gowns again, adding fresh trim from the haberdasher's sale bin. She would ensure her sisters looked presentable, even if she herself did not. She would manage, as she always managed, because someone had to. "A summer in the country," Catherine said dreamily. "Away from this horrid little house and all the people who whisper about us. Perhaps it won't be so bad." Arabella privately doubted this optimism, but held her tongue. Let Catherine have her dreams of assemblies and titled suitors. Reality would assert itself soon enough, as it always did for the Thorne family. She looked out the window again, watching the rain fall on the cramped street in the unfashionable corner of London, where they eked out their reduced existence. Somewhere out there was a great estate called Thornwood, presided over by a duke who probably never spared a thought for families like hers, families who had once had everything and now had nothing, whose days were spent in the dreary arithmetic of poverty, counting pennies and calculating exactly how long they could survive before even those ran out. A duke. Arabella almost laughed at the absurdity of her mother's hopes. She would sooner marry a chimney-sweep than a duke. At least a chimney-sweep worked for his living and didn't expect the world to bow before him simply because his ancestors had been clever enough to curry favour with a long-dead monarch. No, if she ever married, which she had no intention of doing, it would be to a man of modest means and sensible disposition. A country vicar, perhaps, or a solicitor. Someone who understood the value of a shilling and the importance of keeping one's promises. Someone entirely unlike her father. Someone entirely unlike a duke. Hartwell Manor proved to be precisely what Arabella had expected. A house that had once been grand, but had declined into shabby gentility through decades of neglect and insufficient funds. Cousin Harriet, a widow of 50, with iron-grey hair and a disposition to match, ruled over it with the grim determination of a general defending an indefensible position. She greeted them with the minimum of warmth required by familial duty, and made immediately clear, through 1,000 small slights, that they were guests on sufferance rather than welcome visitors. But the house had beds that were clean if not comfortable. The food was plain but sufficient. And most importantly, they were away from London and the constant whispered reminders of their disgrace. Arabella found, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked the village of Thornwood. It was a pleasant cluster of stone cottages and small shops, centred around a medieval church whose spire could be seen from miles away. The people were friendly enough to strangers, going about their business with the particular self-contained contentment of those whose lives were governed by seasons and soil rather than society's whims. Best of all, no one here knew or cared about Baron Thorne's gambling debts, his mistresses, or the spectacular scene he had caused at White's shortly before his heart had given out a blessing, some said, since it had spared him the indignity of debtor's prison. Arabella could walk through the village without feeling the weight of pitying or contemptuous stares. She could simply be Miss Thorne, a visiting relation, unremarkable and unencumbered by scandal. 2 weeks into their stay, she escaped the house one afternoon, while her mother napped and her sisters squabbled over a fashion magazine Catherine had somehow acquired. Cousin Harriet had made pointed remarks about the cost of feeding 4 additional mouths, and Arabella needed air before she said something regrettable. The meadows beyond the village beckoned, vast expanses of green and gold, stretching toward the dark line of a forest on the horizon. Arabella walked without destination, simply relishing the freedom of solitude, the sweet scent of grass and wildflowers, the distant lowing of cattle. The sky was vast and blue above her, unmarred by London's perpetual haze of coal smoke. She had gone perhaps half a mile when her foot found the rabbit hole. The ankle twisted with a sickening wrench, sending her sprawling onto the grass with a cry of surprise and pain. For a moment she simply lay there, staring up at the clouds, cataloguing the damage. Not broken, she could move her toes, flex her foot, but certainly sprained, and badly enough that walking home would be an adventure. "Wonderful," she muttered to the uncaring sky. "Absolutely wonderful." She pushed herself to sitting and examined the offending ankle, already beginning to swell beneath her stocking. The walk home would take an hour at this rate, assuming she could walk at all. Cousin Harriet would be furious about the inconvenience. Her mother would lament loudly about doctors' fees they couldn't afford. Catherine would be annoyed that attention was diverted from her own concerns. "May I be of assistance?" Arabella's head snapped up, her heart lurching with surprise. She had been so absorbed in her misery that she hadn't heard anyone approach. A man stood several feet away, watching her with an expression of mild concern. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in clothing that was well made but simple, no elaborate waistcoat or pristine cravat. Just a plain dark coat over a shirt that had clearly seen a day's wear. His hair was dark and dishevelled, falling across a forehead that bore the faint sheen of recent exertion. His face was striking rather than classically handsome, with strong bones and a firm jaw, but it was his eyes that caught her, grey as storm clouds, unexpectedly warm despite their cool colour. A land steward, she decided. Or perhaps an estate manager. Someone who worked for a living, at any rate, rather than merely existing on inherited wealth. "I seem to have found a rabbit hole with my ankle," she said, embarrassment sharpening her tone more than she intended. "I don't require assistance, merely a moment to collect myself." "Ah!" He moved closer, his gaze dropping to her obviously swelling ankle. "That moment appears to be taking rather a long time. The rabbit hole in question was quite victorious, I think." "Are you mocking me?" "I am observing the battlefield." He crouched beside her, and she caught the scent of him, clean linen, hoarse, something green and herbal. "May I?" Before she could protest, he had gently taken her ankle in his hands, probing with careful fingers. She hissed at a spike of pain. "Not broken," he announced, "but a nasty sprain. You won't be walking far on this today." I had arrived at that conclusion myself, thank you. She pulled her ankle from his grasp, aware that her cheeks were flushing and annoyed by it. "I simply need a moment's rest, and then you'll hobble half a mile across uneven ground and do yourself genuine injury." He raised an eyebrow in a way that reminded her irritatingly of her own habit. "I think not. Where are you?" "Staying. I'll help you home." "I don't even know who you are." "Sebastian Ashworth." He offered a slight bow, incongruously formal, given that he was crouched in a meadow beside a dishevelled woman. "At your service." Ashworth. The name tugged at her memory. Wasn't that the Duke's family name? But this plainly dressed man couldn't be the Duke himself. A distant relation, perhaps, employed on the estate in some capacity. "Miss Arabella Thorne," she said reluctantly. "I'm staying at Hartwell Manor, with my cousin, Mrs. Harriet Blackwood." "Mrs. Blackwood, of course. I know the property." He rose and extended his hand. "Come, Miss Thorne. I promise I have no nefarious intentions, merely a disinclination to leave injured women stranded in meadows." She looked at his hand, at his patient expression, at the undeniable reality of her throbbing ankle. Pride warred with practicality, and practicality, as always in her life, won. She took his hand. He pulled her up easily, steadying her as she found her balance on one foot. When she attempted a step and nearly crumpled, He made an exasperated sound and simply wrapped an arm around her waist. "Lean on me. I won't let you fall." They began the slow journey back toward Hartwell, her arm draped over his shoulders, his arm firm around her waist. It was shockingly improper. If anyone saw them, her reputation, such as it was, would be in tatters. But the alternative was crawling home on her hands and knees, and even Arabella's pride had its limits. "You're not from the area," he said after several minutes of silence. "I would have remembered you." Is that meant as a compliment or an observation? Simply a statement of fact. The village is small. New faces are noticed. We arrived a fortnight ago. My mother and sisters and I are guests of Cousin Harriet for the summer. Ah. He guided her around a patch of rough ground with the ease of long familiarity. "And how do you find Thornwood? Pleasant enough? Quiet? A welcome change from London?" "You don't care for London." Arabella laughed, the sound more bitter than she intended. "I don't care for what London has become for my family. Once perhaps we might have enjoyed it. Now we merely endure it." She felt him glance at her, but didn't meet his eyes. Why was she telling a stranger this? She blamed the pain, the embarrassment, the peculiar intimacy of their position. "The village may be quiet," he said, "but it has its own pleasures. Good people, for the most part. A lending library that is better stocked than you might expect. Walking paths through the estate when one watches for rabbit holes. I shall endeavour to be more vigilant in future." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional bird. Arabella became aware, against her will, that Mr. Ashworth smelled quite pleasant, and that his arm around her waist was steady and warm, and nothing like the grabbing hands of London dandies, who used any excuse to touch a woman. "You," said the estate, she ventured finally. "You work for the Duke, then?" Something flickered across his face, amusement perhaps, or something more complex. "In a manner of speaking." "What manner would that be?" "I manage certain affairs." His tone was odd, almost self-deprecating, though some might argue I manage them poorly. "The village seems prosperous enough. The tenants I've seen appear content. If you are responsible for that, I would say you manage quite well." He turned his head to look at her, surprise evident in his grey eyes. "That's a generous assessment from someone who has known me all of 10 minutes and spent half that time annoyed with me." "I am capable of observing evidence and drawing conclusions. The cottages are well maintained. The fields are productive. The children are fed and clothed. These things do not happen by accident. Someone is doing their job properly." "And you attribute that to me rather than the Duke?" Arabella snorted. "The Duke? Please. Men like that don't trouble themselves with the welfare of their tenants. They collect the rents and spend them on horses and hunting and mistresses, leaving the actual work to men like you. If this estate is well run, I guarantee it is because someone beneath the Duke's notice is doing the running." Mr. Ashworth made a strangled sound that might have been a cough or a laugh. "You have strong opinions about dukes. I have strong opinions about the aristocracy in general. They are, in my experience, a collection of pampered children who have never done a day's honest work and wouldn't recognize responsibility if it introduced itself at a ball." "That seems rather sweeping." "Does it? I have known earls who gambled away their children's inheritance without a moment's thought, viscounts who made promises they never intended to keep, barons who—" She stopped abruptly, aware that she was about to reveal too much. "Suffice it to say, my experience of titled gentlemen has not inclined me toward admiration." They had reached the edge of Hartwell's property now, the manor house visible in the distance. Mr. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. "Not all titled men are the same," he said finally. "Some take their responsibilities seriously. Some spend sleepless nights worrying about their tenants, their estates, the weight of obligation they carry. Some never asked for the positions they hold and would give anything to set them down. perhaps. Arabella's tone was sceptical. But I have yet to meet such a man, and I don't expect to meet one. The system itself corrupts, how could it not? When a man is told from birth that he is better than everyone around him, that his blood makes him special, that the world exists to serve his pleasure, how can he possibly grow into a decent person? You believe character is entirely shaped by circumstance? I believe circumstance shapes opportunity, and opportunity shapes choice, and choice reveals character. A duke has never had to choose between his integrity and his survival. How can we possibly know what he is made of? Mr. Ashworth was silent so long that Arabella wondered if she had offended him. When she glanced at his face, his expression was strange, almost pained. "You may be right," he said quietly. "Perhaps circumstance is everything. Perhaps we are all merely the product of our advantages and disadvantages." "I didn't say that." She frowned, feeling somehow that she had scored a point she hadn't intended to score. "I said the aristocracy, as a class, is corrupted by privilege. Individual exceptions may exist. I simply haven't encountered any." "Perhaps you haven't been looking in the right places. Or perhaps the right places don't exist." They reached the gate to Hartwell's garden, and Mr. Ashworth helped her through it, his arm still warm and steady around her waist. The kitchen door was visible now, and beyond it, the sure end of this strange interlude. "I should leave you here," he said. "I wouldn't want to cause talk by being seen with you in such a compromising position." "Compromising?" Arabella almost laughed. "Mr. Ashworth, I am a penniless spinster with a scandal-ridden family name. My reputation was compromised long before you found me in that meadow." His brows drew together. "You speak of yourself as if you were worthless." "I speak of myself as society sees me. There is a difference." "Is there? You seemed quite convinced of your own assessments earlier." She opened her mouth to deliver a sharp retort, then closed it again. He had a point, and she was too honest to deny it. "Perhaps I am harder on myself than I should be," she admitted, "but the world has given me ample reason to lower my expectations." "Then the world is a fool." He said it simply, matter-of-factly, as if stating an obvious truth. "Miss Thorne, I have known you less than an hour, and I can already see that you are intelligent, perceptive, honest to a fault, and possessed of a wit that would put half of London to shame. If society cannot see your worth, the failing is society's, not yours." Arabella stared at him, momentarily robbed of speech. No one had spoken to her like that in years, perhaps ever. Her father had called her his clever girl, but absently, the way he had done everything absently. Her mother had spent 2 decades trying to sand away her sharp edges, and the men of the ton, the few who had bothered to notice her at all, had made it clear that wit in a woman was an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a quality to be admired. "You don't know me," she said finally, her voice strange in her own ears. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you judge people by their actions rather than their titles. I know you love your family even when they frustrate you. I know you would rather crawl home on your hands and knees than accept help you believe you don't deserve." He smiled, and it transformed his face, warming those grey eyes until they were silver. "I know enough." "Mr. Ashworth, Sebastian." He stepped back, releasing her, and she suddenly felt cold despite the summer warmth. "My friends call me Sebastian. We are not friends. We are barely acquaintances." "Then perhaps we should remedy that." He bowed that oddly formal bow again, as if he were playing a role in a drama only he understood. "I walk this way most afternoons. If your ankle heals and you find yourself in need of conversation, you might find me in the meadow. I promise to warn you of any rabbit holes." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his long strides carrying him quickly across the meadow toward the tree line. Arabella watched him go, one hand braced against the garden gate, her ankle throbbing and her mind whirling. What an extraordinary man! What a strange, extraordinary, entirely improper man! She hobbled toward the kitchen door, already composing the story she would tell her family. A turned ankle, a kind stranger who helped her home, nothing more. But even as she rehearsed the sanitized version of events, she found herself replaying their conversation, his words echoing in her mind. If society cannot see your worth, the failing is society's, not yours. No one had ever said such a thing to her. No one had ever looked at her the way he had looked at her, as if she were a puzzle worth solving, a book worth reading, a person worth knowing. It meant nothing, of course. A chance encounter with a kind man who would forget her by tomorrow. She would probably never see him again. But as she limped into the kitchen and began the performance of explaining her injury, Arabella found herself hoping, against all evidence and reason, that she might. She saw him again 3 days later, in the village lending library. Her ankle had healed enough to bear weight, though she still walked with a slight limp. She had escaped the house under the pretext of exchanging books Cousin Harriet approved of reading, or at least approved of the appearance of improving one's mind, and was browsing the surprisingly well-stocked shelves when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss Thorne, your ankle appears to have made a remarkable recovery." She turned, her heart giving an entirely unwelcome leap. Sebastian Ashworth stood in the narrow aisle between shelves, dressed as plainly as before, a book tucked under his arm. In the dim light of the library, his grey eyes seemed almost luminous. "Mr. Ashworth." She refused to use his Christian name, no matter how he had invited it. "I didn't expect to see you here. I come most weeks. The library is one of the village's finest amenities." He moved closer, examining the shelf she had been perusing. "Philosophy? I would have expected novels." "Why? Because I am a woman, and women are presumed to care only for romance and fashion. Because most people prefer fiction to philosophy. I made no assumptions about your sex." Arabella felt herself flush. "I apologize. I am too accustomed to defending myself against assumptions." "A habit born of necessity, I suspect." He pulled a volume from the shelf lock, she noticed, and leafed through it idly. "Though I would argue that novels are as worthy of serious attention as philosophy. Both attempt to make sense of human experience. They simply use different tools." "That is not a position I would expect from a—" She stopped, uncertain how to categorize him. "From a man of practical affairs." "A man of practical affairs?" He smiled, and again she was struck by how it transformed his face. "Is that what you've decided I am? You said you manage affairs for the estate. You dress simply. You speak intelligently, but without the elaborate posturing of the educated elite. You seem to know the land intimately. What else would you be? Perhaps I am a philosopher who manages affairs on the side." "Now you're mocking me again." "I am suggesting that people are rarely as simple as our categories would make them. A man may be many things at once." He replaced the lock and selected a different volume, this time a novel she recognized. "Have you read this?" It was Fanny Burney's Evelina. Arabella nodded. "Twice. I found it both entertaining and pointed. Miss Burney has a sharp eye for society's hypocrisies." "She does, though I wonder if she is too kind to her heroine. Evelina's innocence protects her from consequences that would destroy a less fortunate woman." "You think virtue should be punished?" "I think virtue without power is vulnerable, and vulnerability without protection leads to suffering. The novel ends happily because Evelina is beautiful, well-born, and lucky. What of the women who share her virtue but not her advantages?" Arabella stared at him. "That is a remarkably sophisticated analysis." "I told you. Novels deserve serious attention. He returned the book to the shelf and turned to face her fully. Miss Thorne, I find myself in need of intelligent conversation. The village offers many pleasures, but intellectual discourse is not chief among them. Would you do me the honor of walking with me? The weather is fine, and I know a path that is entirely free of rabbit holes. It was improper. It was unwise. It would certainly set tongues wagging if anyone saw them. But Arabella thought of the endless hours at Hartwell, listening to her mother's complaints and her cousin's pointed remarks, and Catherine's romantic fantasies. She thought of the crushing weight of her responsibilities, the constant performance of competence and contentment she was required to maintain. She thought of how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her as if her mind mattered. "Very well," she said, "but I warn you, Mr. Ashworth, I argue when I disagree. If you are seeking a companion who will simply nod and smile, you have chosen poorly." His grin widened. "Miss Thorne, if I wanted someone to nod and smile, I would speak to a mirror. I chose you precisely because I expect you to argue." The walk became walks, plural, then regular walks, then something Arabella hesitated to name, but increasingly looked forward to. They met in the meadow, or at the library, or occasionally in the village when chance, or perhaps not chance, brought them to the same place at the same time. They walked for hours, discussing everything, philosophy and politics, literature and history, the state of England's economy and the futures of her sisters, and his opinions on farming methods and her memories of London before her family's fall. Sebastian was, she discovered, the most interesting man she had ever met. He was well read beyond anyone she had known, his mind ranging easily across disciplines and centuries. But he wore his learning lightly, using it to illuminate rather than to impress. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, with an attention that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced. When they disagreed, as they often did, he engaged with her arguments rather than dismissing them, meeting her point for point with a respect that was almost disorienting. And yet, for all his openness, there were things he did not speak of. He deflected questions about his past with practiced ease. He never mentioned family, or how he came to work on the estate, or what his life had been before he appeared in that meadow like some benevolent spirit. When she pressed, he changed the subject. When she pushed harder, he retreated into silence. "You are a man of mysteries, Mr. Ashworth," she said one afternoon, as they walked along the edge of a stream that marked the boundary between Hartwell's property and the Thornwood estate. "Sebastian," he corrected, as he always did, "and all men have mysteries. The interesting ones simply have more of them." "Is that meant to be charming? Is it working?" Arabella suppressed a smile. "You are deflecting again." "I am protecting my air of intrigue. If I told you everything, you might find me disappointingly ordinary." "I somehow doubt that." He glanced at her, something flickering in his grey eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "Do you?" "You are many things, Mr. Ashworth, but ordinary is not among them." She paused, considering her next words. "Though I confess I do not understand what you want from our acquaintance. You are a man of education and presumably means. I am a spinster of no fortune and less prospects. There are other women in this village, women who could offer you companionship without the taint of association with a disgraced family." Sebastian stopped walking. When she turned to face him, his expression was more serious than she had ever seen it. "Is that truly what you believe? That I seek your company, despite your circumstances, rather than because of who you are? I believe you must have reasons for spending time with a woman who has nothing to offer." "Nothing to offer?" He repeated the words as if tasting something bitter. "Miss Thorne, Arabella." He used her Christian name for the first time, and something trembled in her chest. "You offer wit, intelligence, honesty, and a perspective unlike anyone I have ever known. You challenge my assumptions and sharpen my thoughts and make me laugh when I had forgotten how. If you believe that to be nothing, then we must have very different definitions of value." She should have had a response. She always had a response. She was Arabella Thorne, sharp-tongued and quick-minded, never at a loss for words. But standing there in the afternoon sunlight, with Sebastian Ashworth looking at her as if she was something precious, she found herself entirely without speech. "I don't—" she began, then stopped, started again. "I am not accustomed to being seen, to being valued, to being told truths about yourself that the world should have shown you long ago." "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "All of that." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the individual shades of grey in his eyes, the slight crook in his nose where it had perhaps once been broken, the fine lines at the corners of his mouth from smiles she was only beginning to know. "Then let me tell you another truth," he said softly. "I have never met anyone like you. I have known duchesses and diamonds of the first water, women groomed from birth to charm and captivate, and not one of them has made me feel the way I feel when you argue with me about the merits of Locke versus Rousseau. I am not spending time with you despite who you are. I am spending time with you because of who you are. The circumstances are irrelevant." Arabella's heart was beating so hard she was certain he must hear it. "You said you have known duchesses." Something shifted in his face, a flicker of what might have been alarm, quickly suppressed. "In passing, the world of great estates is smaller than you might think. You speak as if you move in that world, but you said, 'I said I manage affairs for the estate,' which is true." He took a breath, visibly composing himself. "Arabella, I want to tell you there are things I should explain." A shout interrupted him. They both turned to see Violet running toward them across the meadow, her skirts hiked to her knees, her hair flying loose from its pins. "Arabella! Arabella! Come quickly!" All the warm confusion of the moment evaporated, replaced by cold dread. Arabella caught her youngest sister as Violet stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. "What is it? What's happened?" "It's Mamma. She received a letter. She's been crying for an hour." Violet gulped air, her words tumbling over each other. "Catherine says we're ruined again, even more ruined than before, and Cousin Harriet is threatening to throw us out. And—" "Slow down!" Arabella gripped Violet's shoulders firmly. "Breathe. Tell me clearly." "I don't know clearly. No one will tell me anything. But Catherine said there was a debt Papa owed that we didn't know about, and the man has found us, and he wants the money, or I don't know what he'll do, but everyone is crying and shouting, and I have to go." Arabella released her sister and turned to Sebastian. "I'm sorry, Go." His face was grave. "Attend to your family." "But Arabella—" He caught her hand briefly, the touch sending electricity up her arm. "If there is anything I can do to help, anything at all, you have only to ask. Please remember that." She nodded, too distracted for courtesy, and hurried after Violet toward the house. Behind her, she felt Sebastian's gaze following her until she disappeared through the garden gate. The crisis proved less apocalyptic than Violet's breathless report had suggested, though it was bad enough. A creditor of her father's, a moneylender of the least reputable sort, had tracked them down and was demanding payment of a debt that had apparently been accruing interest for years. The sum was staggering, far beyond anything the family could hope to produce. If they could not pay, the moneylender's letter implied, there were other ways of settling accounts. Ways that involved courts and prison and the complete annihilation of whatever remained of the Thorne family's tattered reputation. Arabella spent 3 days managing the crisis, writing letters, calculating figures, pawning the last of her mother's jewelry, and negotiating with the creditor's representative, a greasy little man who seemed to take pleasure in her family's desperation. In the end, she managed to arrange a payment schedule that would beggar them for years but keep them out of prison. She did not see Sebastian. She thought of him, though, constantly. In the quiet moments between catastrophes, she would remember his face in the meadow, the intensity in his voice, the way he had said, "I have never met anyone like you." She would remember his offer of help and wonder what it would have meant to accept it. But she could not accept help from a stranger, and for all their conversations, Sebastian Ashworth was still a stranger, a man of mysteries who would not reveal his past, a man who spoke of knowing duchesses in passing, who moved through the world of great estates as if it were his natural habitat despite his simple dress, a man who was keeping secrets. By the time the crisis had resolved itself into ongoing misery, a full week had passed. Arabella walked to the meadow on a grey afternoon, half hoping and half dreading that Sebastian would be there. He was. He was sitting on a fallen log, a book open on his knee, but his attention was clearly not on the page. When he saw her, he rose immediately, his face a study in relief and concern. "Arabella, I've been worried. I asked in the village, but no one seemed to know. Is everything all right?" "No." She stopped a few feet from him, suddenly exhausted by the effort of maintaining appearances. "Nothing is all right. My father left debts we didn't know about. A creditor has found us. We've had to pay money we didn't have to avoid consequences we couldn't bear. My family is poorer than ever. My prospects are worse than ever. And I am so tired." Her voice cracked. "I am so very tired of holding everything together." She did not cry. She never cried. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. But something must have shown in her face, because Sebastian crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. She should have pushed him away. She should have maintained the proper distance between a respectable woman and a man who was not her relative or her betrothed. Instead, she leaned into him, letting his warmth and solidity shore her up, letting herself be held for the first time in as long as she could remember. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could have helped." "You couldn't. No one could. This is simply the life we have now paying for my father's sins, one humiliation at a time. That isn't fair." "No." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "But when has life ever been fair? I learned long ago not to expect justice. I expect only survival." Sebastian's expression was pained, as if her words had wounded him personally. "Arabella, you deserve so much more than survival. You deserve happiness and security, and what I deserve is irrelevant. I am not the heroine of a novel, Mr. Ashworth. There is no wealthy benefactor waiting to rescue me, no lost fortune to be discovered, no miracle to transform my circumstances. There is only me doing what must be done, for as long as I can do it. And after that? I don't think about after that." She stepped back, putting distance between them. "I can't afford to think about after that." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Sebastian spoke, his voice careful. "There is a ball next week, at the Thornwood estate. The Duke is hosting a midsummer celebration, a revival of an old tradition. The entire neighborhood has been invited." Arabella laughed humorlessly. "I am aware. My cousin has spoken of nothing else for days. Catherine is beside herself with excitement. Apparently the Duke is unmarried and fantastically wealthy, and she has convinced herself that this is her chance to make the match of the century. Will you attend?" "I have no choice. Cousin Harriet has made it clear that we are expected to accompany her, if only to add to her consequence as hostess of the visiting relations." Arabella's lip curled. "I shall spend the evening watching Catherine throw herself at a man who will not spare her a glance. while my mother calculates how many titled heads are in the room. It should be a thoroughly enjoyable experience. You don't wish to go? I wish never to set foot in a duke's house. I wish never to stand in a ballroom and feel the weight of other people's wealth pressing down on me. I wish... She stopped herself. It doesn't matter what I wish. I shall go, and I shall smile, and I shall pretend to be the grateful poor relation everyone expects me to be. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then, perhaps the evening will surprise you. I have had quite enough. Surprises lately, thank you. Perhaps it will have pleasures you didn't anticipate. Such as? Such as seeing someone you know, someone who might ask you to dance. Arabella's heart did something complicated in her chest. You'll be there. Yes. I have certain duties that will require my presence. Then perhaps the evening won't be a complete waste. She meant it to sound casual, dismissive even, but it came out softer than she intended. I would be glad to see a friendly face. You'll see more than that. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm around hers. Arabella, I need to tell you there are things about me you don't know. Things I should have told you weeks ago. I wanted to, but I was afraid that once you knew, you would look at me differently. That everything between us would change. A cold tendril of dread curled in her stomach. What things? He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away, his jaw tight. Not here, not like this. But soon at the ball, or before it, I promise I will tell you everything. Will you trust me until then? Trust. Such a simple word for such a complicated thing. Arabella had trusted before, trusted her father's promises, trusted society's rules, trusted that virtue and hard work would protect her from the worst of life's cruelties. She had learned through painful repetition that trust was a luxury the vulnerable could not afford. And yet this man had treated her with more respect in a few weeks than she had received in years. He had listened to her, valued her, argued with her as an equal. He had held her when she was falling apart and asked for nothing in return. Whatever secret he was keeping, whatever truth he feared to tell, could it really be so terrible? I don't know if I can trust you, she said honestly. I don't know if I can trust anyone, but She squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against her palm. I want to believe that what I have seen in you is real. That the man who walked me home from that meadow, who argued with me about philosophy, who made me feel like I mattered that man exists, regardless of what else may be true. He exists, Sebastian said softly. He is more real with you than he has ever been with anyone. Whatever else you learn about me, please remember that. I will try. She meant it as a promise, though she was not sure what she was promising. She only knew that when she looked at Sebastian Ashworth, she felt something she had thought herself incapable of feeling. Hope. The day of the ball dawned bright and clear, as if the weather itself had decided to cooperate with the Duke of Thornwood's grand revival of tradition. Arabella spent the morning helping her sisters prepare, letting Catherine practice her curtsies, and selecting ribbons for Violet's hair. Her mother fluttered from room to room, delivering contradictory advice and lamenting, not for the first time, the absence of the family jewels that would have made Catherine truly splendid. For herself, Arabella had done what she could with what she had. She had unpicked and re-sewn her best gown, a soft green muslin that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, adding fresh trim and adjusting the bodice until it fit her properly. Her honey-gold hair was pinned in a style that was simple but becoming, a few curls left loose to soften her face. She looked, she thought critically, like exactly what she was, a woman making the best of limited resources. It would have to be enough. The carriage ride to Thornwood was tense with Catherine's barely contained excitement and their mother's endless stream of instructions about deportment and the importance of making a good impression. Arabella sat silently by the window, watching the estate come into view. Thornwood Hall was magnificent. There was no other word for it. A vast Palladian mansion set amid acres of manicured grounds. It rose against the evening sky like something from a dream, all golden stone and gleaming windows, and classical proportions that spoke of centuries of wealth and power. Arabella's stomach clenched. This was the world Sebastian belonged to, or adjacent to at least. This was the world she had spent years railing against, full of people who had never known want, never calculated whether they could afford meat this week, never worn patched stockings beneath their ball gowns. And yet somewhere in that great house was the man who had held her in a meadow and told her she deserved happiness. She clung to that thought as she climbed the marble steps, as she passed through the soaring entrance hall, as she followed the stream of guests toward the ballroom. The ballroom itself was breathtaking, hung with crystals that caught the candlelight and scattered rainbows across the walls, banked with flowers that perfumed the air, filled with the glitter of jewels and the rustle of silk. An orchestra played in the gallery above. Footmen circulated with champagne. Everything spoke of taste, elegance, and unlimited resources. Catherine grabbed Arabella's arm, her nails digging in with excitement. "There are so many people, so many important people. Oh, Arabella, do you see the Countess of Lindley? And that must be Sir Reginald Blackwood. He's said to have 20,000 a year and—" "Catherine," Arabella gently extricated her arm, "you're drawing attention." But her sister was no longer listening. Her eyes had fixed on the grand staircase at the far end of the room, where a ripple of anticipation was passing through the crowd. "The Duke," someone whispered nearby. "The Duke is coming." Arabella looked up, curious despite herself. The mysterious Duke of Thornwood, whose estate she had been walking for weeks, whose tenants spoke of him with such surprising warmth. She realized suddenly that she had never asked Sebastian what the Duke was like. Perhaps Sebastian would introduce her. Perhaps she would finally see for herself whether this particular Duke was any different from the rest of his kind. The major domo appeared at the top of the stairs, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed room. "His Grace, Sebastian Ashworth, the Duke of Thornwood." Arabella's heart stopped. She knew the man who descended those stairs. She knew the dark hair falling across his forehead, the grey eyes that had watched her argue about philosophy, the tall form that had held her upright when her ankle gave way. She knew him as she knew her own reflection. But he was not wearing plain clothes now. He was dressed in the full evening regalia of his rank midnight blue coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, snowy white cravat tied to perfection, diamond pin winking at his throat. He moved with an assurance she had never seen in him before, a natural command that transformed his quiet intensity into something almost regal. The Duke of Thornwood. Sebastian. Her Sebastian. No, not hers. Not anything. A duke. A duke who had lied to her for weeks, who had listened to her rail against the aristocracy while concealing that he was its apex predator, who had let her believe he was different. Their eyes met across the ballroom. She saw recognition in his face, and hope, and something that looked terrifyingly like pleading. She turned away. "Arabella?" Catherine's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? You've gone quite pale." "I need air." The words scraped past the tightness in her throat. "I need excuse me." She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the startled looks, ignoring her mother's hiss of disapproval. She had to get out of this room, away from the lights and the music and the terrible, shattering truth. He was a duke. All this time, all these weeks, he was a duke, and she was a fool. The terrace was blessedly empty, the other guests still inside watching the duke make his entrance like courtiers attending their king. Arabella gripped the stone balustrade and forced herself to breathe in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way she had taught herself during the worst days after Papa's death, when the creditors came calling, and her mother took to her bed and the entire weight of their ruined world had settled on her shoulders. She would not cry. She would not give him that satisfaction. The French doors opened behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Arabella, Your Grace. She invested the title with all the contempt she could muster. I believe we have not been properly introduced. I am Miss Thorne, a penniless nobody of no consequence whatsoever, and you, I have just learned, are the Duke of Thornwood. How delightful to make your acquaintance at last. Please. His voice was raw in a way she had never heard it. Please, let me explain. Explain what exactly? She turned to face him then, and the sight of him in his ducal finery sent a fresh wave of fury through her veins. Explain how you lied to me for weeks, how you let me believe you were a land steward or some such. Let me pour out my heart about my family and my circumstances and my opinions about the aristocracy, all while secretly laughing at the naive little fool who didn't know she was being played for entertainment. I never laughed at you. You never told me the truth. Her voice cracked on the words, and she hated herself for showing weakness. I asked you, Sebastian. I asked you directly what you did, and you said you managed affairs for the estate. You let me assume. I know what I let you assume. He took a step toward her, and she stepped back, keeping the distance between them. Pain flashed across his face. I know, and I have no excuse. I should have told you from the beginning. I meant to tell you. Every day I meant to tell you, and every day I found another reason to wait. What reasons could possibly justify? Because you looked at me like I was a person. The words exploded from him with an intensity that momentarily shocked her into silence. You argued with me, challenged me, treated me like an equal rather than a title. Do you know how long it has been since anyone did that? Do you know what it is like to walk through the world, knowing that everyone who speaks to you is calculating your worth, measuring your influence, wondering what they can gain from your favor? My heart bleeds for you, Arabella said coldly. The poor Duke, so burdened by his wealth and power, and the endless attention of those who wish to benefit from his patronage. However do you bear it? You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You were bored with being fawned over, so you decided to play act as a common man. And I was your entertainment, the sharp-tongued spinster who didn't know her place, who said amusing things about aristocrats not knowing that she was speaking to one. Tell me, did you go home after our conversations and laugh about me with your servants? Did you describe the scene to your friends, the ridiculous Miss Thorne, who thought she was being courted by a land steward? Courted? Something shifted in his expression. Is that what you thought? That I was courting you? The question hit her like a blow. Because yes, that was what she had thought, had hoped, had begun to let herself believe despite every instinct that warned her against it. She had thought Sebastian Ashworth, humble estate manager, was falling in love with her. She had thought that perhaps, against all odds, she had found someone who saw her true worth. And now she discovered that the man she had been falling for didn't exist. It doesn't matter what I thought, she said, her voice going flat and cold. What matters is that you deceived me. You let me believe. She stopped, unwilling to reveal the full extent of her foolishness. You let me believe a lie, and now, Your Grace, I would appreciate it if you would leave me alone. I'm certain you have guests to attend to, important people who know who you really are. Arabella, please. Miss Thorne, she rapped, the formality around herself like armor.
We are not friends. We never were. I was merely a diversion, and the diversion is now ended."
She moved to push past him, to return to the ballroom, where at least she could lose herself in the crowd. But he caught her arm gently, but firmly enough to stop her. "What you saw in me was real," he said quietly. "The man who walked with you, talked with you, argued with you about philosophy and novels and the state of England, that was me. The truest version of me. Not the Duke, not the title, not the role I was forced into when my brother died, and my world fell apart. Just Sebastian. Just the man who fell in love with you." Arabella's heart clenched painfully at the words, but she forced herself to ignore the flutter of hope they sparked. Hope was dangerous. Hope was how you got hurt. "Pretty words," she said, "but words are easy. You've had weeks to practice them." "I've had weeks of agony, knowing that every day I didn't tell you made the eventual revelation worse. I've had weeks of trying to find the right moment, the right words, some way to explain that wouldn't make you hate me." He released her arm and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. "I failed. I know I failed. But please believe me when I say it was never about entertainment or mockery or anything other than wanting to be seen as myself for once in my life." "And what about what I wanted?" Arabella's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "I wanted to be seen too, Your Grace. I wanted someone who understood what it was like to have nothing, to struggle, to be dismissed by the very people you pretend to disdain. Instead, I got a duke playing at poverty for his own amusement. It wasn't— Do you know what it's like to count every penny? To wear patched stockings beneath your one good gown because you can't afford new ones? To watch your mother fade away from disappointment and your sisters grow desperate with the knowledge that their futures hold nothing but more of the same?" Tears were threatening now, burning behind her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "No, you don't, because you have never wanted for anything in your life. You can dress in plain clothes and pretend to be common, but you will never know what it is to truly have nothing." Sebastian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "You're right. I don't know what it is to have nothing. But I know what it is to have everything and still feel empty. I know what it is to inherit a title you never wanted, to fill shoes you know you can never properly fill, to spend every day being told you are the Duke while knowing in your heart that you are an impostor." He looked at her with eyes that held more pain than she had ever seen in him. "My brother was supposed to be the Duke, Marcus. He was born for it, charming, confident, everything a duke should be. I was the second son, the spare, the one who could pursue his own interests, because no one expected anything of me. And then there was an accident, and Marcus and my father were killed, and suddenly I was supposed to become someone I had never been trained to be." Arabella said nothing, but something in her softened slightly at the grief in his voice. "I hide in the country because I cannot bear London. I dress simply because the trappings of the title feel like a costume I'm not entitled to wear. I walk my own land and talk to my own tenants because it's the only way I feel like I'm actually accomplishing something useful, rather than simply existing as a figurehead for a system I never asked to be part of." He took a breath. "And then I met you. And you didn't treat me like a duke because you didn't know I was one. You just talked to me, argued with me, saw me, the real me, not the title. Do you have any idea how intoxicating that was?" "So I was a novelty," Arabella said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "A change from the sycophants. You were the first person in 3 years who made me feel like Sebastian, not Thornwood. The first person who made me laugh. The first person who made me think that perhaps my life didn't have to be an endless performance of a role I was never meant to play." He stepped closer, and this time she didn't step back. "I fell in love with you, Arabella, not with your circumstances or your family name or any calculation of advantage. I fell in love with your wit and your courage, and your fierce determination to protect those you care about. I fell in love with the way you argue about philosophy, and the way you refuse to accept easy answers, and the way you see through pretense to the truth beneath. I fell in love with you, and I'm so desperately sorry that I was too afraid to tell you who I really was before you found out like this." Arabella's armor was cracking. She could feel it, the anger that had been sustaining her, giving way to something more complicated, something that wanted to believe him despite every rational reason not to. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I know. I had a right to know. I know. I don't know if I can trust you now. I know that too." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. She let him. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am not asking you to trust me immediately. I am only asking you to give me a chance to earn that trust. Let me show you who I really am, not the Duke, not the role, but the man who loves you. Let me prove that what you saw in me was real." Arabella looked at their joined hands, his fingers warm around hers. She thought of all the conversations they had shared, all the moments of connection that had felt so genuine. She thought of the way he listened to her, valued her, treated her as an equal. And she thought of her father, who had also made promises, who had also sworn that everything would be fine. "I can't," she said, pulling her hand away. "I can't do this, Sebastian. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I need time to think. I need to understand what was real and what was performance. It was all real. Everything between us was real. You'll forgive me if I don't simply take your word for that." She straightened her spine, pulling together the fragments of her composure. "I'm going to return to the ballroom now. I would appreciate it if you would not follow me." She saw the protest form on his lips, saw him struggle with it and finally swallow it back. "As you wish," he said quietly. "But Arabella, Miss Thorne—" He caught himself, respecting the distance she had demanded. "I meant what I said, every word, and I will wait as long as you need." She turned and walked away, back through the French doors into the glittering ballroom, leaving him alone on the terrace with the weight of his confession hanging in the summer air. The following weeks were torture. Arabella could not escape Sebastian. He was the Duke, and his presence permeated every aspect of life in Thornwood. He was mentioned in every conversation, discussed at every dinner table, speculated about by every hopeful mamma with a daughter to launch. Catherine spoke of nothing else, analyzing his appearance at the ball, his brief interactions with various guests, his rumoured fortune, and his notable lack of a duchess. "He seemed quite distracted during the ball, didn't you think?" Catherine mused one morning over breakfast. "Several people tried to engage him in conversation, but he kept looking around as if searching for someone. Very mysterious." Arabella concentrated on her toast and said nothing. "They say he's never shown interest in any of the London debutantes," her mother added, with the particular calculating tone that meant she was formulating matrimonial strategies. "Perhaps he simply hasn't met the right woman yet. Someone different from the typical society girls, someone with more substance. Or perhaps he simply prefers his own company," Arabella said flatly. "Not everyone is desperate for matrimony." "What a peculiar thing to say." Her mother fixed her with a sharp look. "You've been in a strange mood since the ball, Arabella. Did something happen?" "Nothing whatsoever. I'm merely tired of endless speculation about the romantic inclinations of a man we have barely met." But she had met him. She knew him, or thought she had known him better than anyone in that ballroom, and that was precisely the problem. She avoided the meadow where they had walked, She avoided the lending library where they had first conversed as something other than strangers. She avoided any place where she might encounter him, constructing her days around the geography of her grief and anger. It was harder to avoid his influence. A week after the ball, an invitation arrived at Hartwell Manor. Mrs. Harriet Blackwood and her guests were requested to attend a garden party at Thornwood Hall. Catherine was ecstatic. Their mother was triumphant. Arabella wanted to refuse, but she had no excuse that wouldn't raise uncomfortable questions. The garden party was beautiful. Of course it was beautiful. Everything Sebastian did was beautiful, with tables set up beneath ancient oaks, and a string quartet playing softly, and servants circulating with refreshments that cost more than Arabella's family spent on food in a month. Sebastian was there, playing the gracious host, and Arabella watched from a distance as he made polite conversation with neighbours and nodded attentively at the local matrons, and somehow managed to be charming, despite the awkwardness she knew he felt in such settings. He caught her eye once, across the lawn. She looked away immediately, but not before she saw the flash of pain in his expression. Good. Let him hurt. She was hurting too. And yet she noticed things, despite her determination not to. She noticed him spending 20 minutes with old Mr. Hendricks, the retired tenant farmer whose mind was beginning to wander, listening patiently to rambling stories about harvests from 50 years past. She noticed him slipping coins to the children who peered through the hedges, shooing them away with gruff affection rather than having them chased off. She noticed the servants looking at him with genuine warmth, rather than the terrified deference she associated with aristocratic households. These things meant nothing, she told herself. A duke could be charming, and still be a liar. A duke could treat his tenants well, and still be unworthy of trust. But the observations accumulated, despite her best efforts. The second week after the ball, Catherine came home flushed with excitement, to announce that she had been approached at church by a most charming gentleman, a Viscount Harrington, lately arrived in the area and staying at an inn while he conducted some manner of business. He had expressed admiration for her beauty and wit, and he had asked permission to call. Arabella felt a prickle of unease at the description. What sort of business would bring a Viscount to Thornwood? I don't know, and I don't care. He's a Viscount, Arabella, with an estate in Hampshire, and oh, you should have heard the way he spoke to me. Like I was the most fascinating woman in the room. Catherine, don't, Arabella. Don't start lecturing me about being careful or sensible or any of the other things you always say. I know you think I'm foolish, but I'm not. I know what I want, and I want a chance at happiness. Is that so wrong? Arabella swallowed her warnings. Her sister was right, she did lecture, did assume the worst, did approach every potential suitor with suspicion. Perhaps this time she was being unfair. Perhaps this Viscount was exactly what he seemed. But the unease remained. Over the following days, Viscount Harrington became a regular presence at Hartwell Manor. He was handsome in a sharp, polished way that Arabella instinctively distrusted all surfaces and no depth, like a portrait that looked impressive until you examined the brushwork. He said all the right things, paid Catherine all the right compliments, and somehow never quite answered direct questions about his estate or his family or his reasons for being in Thornwood. I don't like him, Arabella told Violet one afternoon when they were alone in the garden. Neither do I, Violet said matter-of-factly. She was 17, but she had always been the most perceptive of the three sisters, watching and listening while others talked. He reminds me of father. The observation struck Arabella like a physical blow. She had been struggling to articulate what exactly bothered her about the Viscount, and Violet had captured it in 5 words. He did remind her of father, the charm that felt practiced rather than genuine, the evasiveness about finances, the way he focused on what he wanted without seeming to consider what anyone else needed. Have you told Catherine? She wouldn't listen. She's determined to see a fairy tale. Violet pulled absently at a blade of grass. I've tried to hint, but she just accuses me of jealousy. What should we do? I don't know. Watch, I suppose. Be ready to catch her when it falls apart. It was a bleak assessment from a 17-year-old, and Arabella's heart ached for her youngest sister, who had already learned that fairy tales were lies and hope was dangerous. The following Sunday, Sebastian approached her after church. She saw him coming and braced herself, constructing walls of ice around her heart. He stopped at a respectful distance, not presuming to take her hand or speak with any intimacy. "Miss Thorne, I wonder if I might have a word." "Your Grace." She kept her voice flat, formal. "I believe I made my feelings clear at the ball." "This is not about—" He stopped, glanced around at the milling congregation, lowered his voice. "This is about your sister, about the man who has been calling on her." Arabella's defences flickered. "You know something about Viscount Harrington?" "I know enough to be concerned." His grey eyes were troubled. "I hesitated to speak because I knew you would think I was interfering, or that I had ulterior motives, or—" He ran a hand through his hair in that familiar, frustrated gesture. "But I cannot in good conscience remain silent when I see your sister in danger." "What kind of danger?" "The Viscount, his name is not Harrington. It's Hertford. He was Lord Hertford until last year, when he was stripped of his title following a scandal involving a young woman in London, a young woman he promised to marry and then ruined and abandoned." Arabella's blood ran cold. "You're certain?" "I recognized him at my garden party. I knew him slightly in London before my brother died. His reputation was already questionable then. Now it's non-existent. He preys on vulnerable young women, particularly those with connections but no fortune. He charms them, compromises them, and then—" Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I don't know what his game is here, but I don't believe for a moment that he genuinely intends to marry your sister." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I tried to find a way to warn you without—" He broke off, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Every way I imagined approaching you seemed like manipulation, like I was using the situation to force you to speak with me. But your sister's safety matters more than my pride, more than whatever chance I might still have with you." Arabella's anger warred with gratitude, with the recognition that he was doing exactly what she would have wanted, putting Catherine's well-being above his own interests. It was the action of an honourable man, and she didn't know what to do with that. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I will speak with Catherine. She may not believe you. Hertford is very convincing, and she is, forgive me, very determined to believe what she wants to believe." "I know my sister." "I know you do, but sometimes knowing isn't enough." He hesitated, then said, "If there is anything I can do to help, anything at all, you have only to ask. I mean that, Miss Thorne. Whatever you may think of me, I am not your enemy." He bowed and walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the churchyard with the weight of his warning heavy in her chest. Catherine did not believe her. "You're making this up," she said flatly when Arabella confronted her that evening. "You're jealous, or you're trying to ruin my chances, or I don't know what your game is, but I won't listen to these lies." "They're not lies. The Duke himself warned me." "The Duke!" Catherine laughed, though there was an edge of hysteria to it. "Since when are you on speaking terms with the Duke? You've been avoiding him ever since the ball, I've seen you. What is this really about, Arabella? Did he reject you? Is that why you're trying to destroy my happiness?" "Catherine, please." "No. I am done listening to you tell me what I can't have, what I should be careful of, how the world is cruel and men are faithless. Maybe all that is true for you, but it doesn't have to be true for me. Richard loves me. He wants to marry me, and I am going to let him, whether you approve or not." "He hasn't proposed yet," Arabella pointed out. "He's made no formal offer. Don't you find that strange? If he truly loved you, why wouldn't he speak to Cousin Harriet or write to Mamma formally? A flicker of doubt crossed Catherine's face, quickly suppressed. He will. He's only waiting for the right moment. Catherine! I said I'm done listening. Catherine's voice rose to a shout, drawing their mother from the next room with expressions of alarm. Leave me alone, Arabella. You've been miserable for years. Don't try to make me miserable too. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Their mother looked at Arabella with bewildered accusation. What on earth did you say to her? Arabella explained, as calmly as she could, what Sebastian had told her about the Viscount, the false name, the scandal, the pattern of targeting vulnerable young women. But even as she spoke, she saw her mother's face closing against the information. The Duke told you this? Her mother's tone was sceptical. And how exactly are you on such intimate terms with the Duke of Thornwood? That's not... Arabella stopped, recognizing the deflection for what it was. What matters is the warning, not its source. What matters is that you are trying to ruin your sister's chances with unsubstantiated gossip. Viscount Harrington is a perfectly respectable gentleman. He has treated Catherine with nothing but proper attention. His name isn't Harrington. He was stripped of his title for enough. Her mother's voice was sharp, in a way it rarely was any more. She had retreated so far into passive misery that active engagement was unusual. I will not hear another word against the Viscount. Your sister deserves happiness, and I will not let your bitterness take that from her. Arabella stared at her mother, seeing for perhaps the first time the depth of denial that had sustained her through years of disappointment. Mrs. Thorne had married a baron and lost everything. She was desperate for one of her daughters to redeem that loss, to prove that the gamble had been worth it, to restore the family to the status they had once enjoyed. She would believe almost anything that supported that hope, and disbelieve almost anything that threatened it. Mamma, Arabella said quietly, I am not bitter. I am trying to protect Catherine from a man who will hurt her. You are protecting no one but yourself. You have always been jealous of Catherine's beauty, her charm. That's not true. And now that she has a chance at a brilliant match, you cannot bear to see her succeed where you failed. The accusation hit its mark, as it was designed to. Arabella had spent her whole life being the sensible one, the practical one, the one who kept the family together while her mother mourned and her sisters dreamed. And for all that effort, she was apparently still seen as the bitter spinster, the obstacle to be overcome rather than the foundation to be relied upon. Fine, she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. Believe what you want. But when this falls apart, when the Viscount shows his true colours and Catherine is left with nothing but regret, remember that I tried to warn you. She turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, into the garden where the evening air was cooling toward night. She stood among the roses that someone else had planted and would tend and eventually abandon when Cousin Harriet died, and the property passed to some distant male relative who cared nothing for flowers. Everything in her life felt like that borrowed, temporary, subject to forces beyond her control. A footstep on the path made her turn. Violet stood in the doorway, her young face tight with concern. I believe you, she said, about the Viscount, about everything. Thank you. The words came out rough with unshed tears, but believing won't be enough to save her. Then we'll have to find another way. Arabella looked at her youngest sister, 17 years old, too wise for her age, carrying burdens no young woman should have to carry. And despite everything, despite the hopelessness of the situation and the overwhelming odds against them, Arabella felt a spark of determination reignite in her chest. Yes, she said, we will. The plan, such as it was, took shape over the following days. Arabella began to investigate the Viscount through every channel available to her. She wrote to acquaintances in London, calling in favours she had carefully hoarded, asking discreet questions about Lord Hertford and his current whereabouts. She visited the village inn where he was staying and made friends with a chambermaid who was happy to gossip in exchange for a few coins. She watched and listened and gathered evidence like a woman building a case for court. What she discovered confirmed Sebastian's warning and added darker details he had likely spared her. The Viscount, she refused to think of him as Hertford, since the title was no longer rightfully his, had ruined at least 3 young women that anyone knew of. He targeted families in difficult circumstances, offering the promise of marriage and security before engineering compromising situations that left his victims with no choice but to accept whatever terms he offered. When their families inevitably couldn't provide the dowries he demanded, he abandoned them to their shame. His game in Thornwood became clearer. He was after whatever modest dowry the Thorn family might be able to scrape together, probably nothing, but a desperate family might sell their last possessions or borrow against their futures. Or perhaps he simply wanted the thrill of another conquest, another innocent woman ruined for his amusement. Either way, Arabella was determined to stop him. The difficulty was convincing Catherine. Her sister had constructed an elaborate fantasy around the Viscount, complete with their future estate in Hampshire and the children they would have, and the triumphant return to society that their marriage would enable. Every attempt to introduce doubt was met with anger and accusations. "You're just like Arabella," Catherine shouted at Violet, who had made her own attempt to intervene. "You want me to be miserable like the rest of you. Well, I won't be. Richard loves me, and I love him, and nothing you say will change that." The crisis came 10 days after Sebastian's warning. Arabella came home from the village to find the house in an uproar. Catherine had disappeared, leaving a note that said she and Richard were eloping to Gretna Green. They had a full day's head start. For one terrible moment, Arabella felt nothing but despair. They were too late. Catherine would be married or worse, compromised beyond repair before anyone could stop it. The Viscount had won, and another young woman would be destroyed by his machinations. Then the despair burned away, replaced by something harder and more determined. She would not let this happen. She would not let her sister become another of that man's victims. If she had to chase them all the way to Scotland, she would drag Catherine back and expose the Viscount for what he was. But she couldn't do it alone. She had no carriage, no resources, no way of travelling fast enough to catch them before they crossed the border. She needed help. She needed Sebastian. The realization sat heavy in her stomach, a bitter irony she had no time to appreciate. After weeks of avoiding him, of nursing her anger and her wounded pride, she was about to throw herself on his mercy. She was about to ask the Duke of Thornwood for help, because he was the only person who could provide what she needed. She left Violet to manage their hysterical mother, and walked, then ran the 2 miles to Thornwood Hall. The footman who answered the door looked startled to see a dishevelled young woman demanding to see the Duke, but something in her expression must have conveyed the urgency, because he showed her to a small sitting room and promised to fetch his Grace immediately. Sebastian appeared within minutes. Still in his shirt sleeves, with ink on his fingers, he had clearly been working when interrupted. The sight of him, rumpled and ordinary, and so far from the distant Duke she had tried to hate, made something twist in her chest. "Arabella!" Her Christian name slipped out before he could stop it, his face pale with concern. "What's happened? Are you hurt?" "Catherine has eloped." The words came out in a rush. "With the Viscount. They left yesterday. They're heading for Gretna Green. I have to stop them, but I have no way. I can't. Wait." He crossed to her, took her hands, steadied her. "Breathe. Tell me everything." She told him the failed warnings, her mother's denial, Catherine's determination to believe the fairy tale, and finally the devastating note that shattered all hope of a quiet resolution. Through it all, Sebastian listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with every detail. "They have a full day's head start," he said when she finished. "If they're travelling by post, they'll be changing horses regularly. They could be as far as Carlisle by now." "Then we're too late." "Not necessarily." His jaw set with determination. "I have fast horses and a light curricle. If we leave immediately and drive through the night, we might be able to intercept them before they reach the border." "We?" "You'll need to be there, to speak to your sister, to witness whatever confrontation occurs. And he hesitated. "I know Hertford. I know his weaknesses. I may be able to stop him in ways you cannot." Arabella should have hesitated. She should have considered the propriety of travelling alone with an unmarried man, the scandal it would cause if anyone discovered them, the complications it would create for whatever remained of her reputation. But Catherine's face swam before her eyes. Catherine, who had always been the pretty one, the hopeful one, the one who still believed in happy endings despite all evidence to the contrary. She couldn't let her sister be destroyed. "Let's go," she said. Sebastian nodded once, all business now, and strode to the door to bark orders at his servants. Within 15 minutes, a curricle was brought around light and fast, built for speed rather than comfort, and Sebastian was helping Arabella up beside him. "This will not be a pleasant journey," he warned. "We'll be travelling through the night, stopping only to change horses. It will be cold and exhausting and possibly dangerous." "I don't care. Just get me to my sister." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his grey eyes. Then he picked up the reins and urged the horses forward, and they flew down the drive toward the road north. The journey blurred into a nightmare of jolting roads and darkness and the endless rhythm of hoofbeats. Sebastian drove with grim concentration, coaxing every possible speed from each team of horses before stopping at coaching inns to exchange them for fresh mounts. Arabella sat beside him, clutching the rail as the curricle bounced over ruts and stones, watching the landscape streak past in the silvery light of a 3/4 moon. They spoke little at first. Arabella was too tired, too worried, too consumed by fears of what they might find when they caught up with Catherine. But as the miles accumulated and the initial shock faded, she became aware of other things. The warmth of Sebastian's arm pressed against hers, the competent way he handled the horses, the occasional glances he sent her way, checking that she was all right. Somewhere past midnight, when they had changed horses for the 3rd time and the road ahead stretched empty and silver, Sebastian finally broke the silence. "You should try to sleep. It will be hours yet before we reach them." "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see Catherine's face." She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the night's chill. "What if we're too late? What if he's already—" "Don't." His voice was firm but gentle. "Don't torture yourself with possibilities. We'll reach them in time, and we'll stop this." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've seen the way you fight for your family. If anyone can save your sister, it's you." Arabella turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time since they'd set out. In the moonlight, his features were all planes and shadows, beautiful in a stark way that made her heart ache. She remembered the first time she'd seen him, in that meadow with her ankle throbbing and her pride stinging, and how she'd thought him extraordinary even then. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "At least, partly wrong." "Oh?" "I thought you were playing games, amusing yourself at my expense. But you weren't, were you? You were just lost." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, I told you once that I never wanted to be Duke, that I spent my whole life expecting to be the secondary son, the one who didn't matter. When Marcus died, it was like a door slammed shut on the person I was supposed to be. I had to become someone else overnight. Someone confident, capable, authoritative. Someone I'd never been and didn't know how to be. So you hid in the country. I hid in the country, and I wore plain clothes, and I walked my own land like a common farmer because it was the only time I felt like myself. And then I met you, and you didn't know who I was, and suddenly I could be Sebastian again. Just Sebastian. Not the Duke. Not the disappointment, not the man struggling to fill his brother's shoes. He glanced at her, vulnerability naked in his expression. I should have told you the truth. I know that. But I was so afraid of losing the only thing that made me feel human. Arabella thought about that, about what it must have been like for him. Suddenly thrust into a role he never wanted, surrounded by people who saw only his title. She thought about her own experience, the way she had been stripped of everything except her responsibilities, forced to be the strong one when she had never signed up for that role. They were more alike than she had wanted to admit. I understand, she said finally. I don't forgive you yet, not entirely, but I understand. And I appreciate what you're doing tonight. You didn't have to help me. Of course I did. He said it simply, as if there were no other possibility. I love you, Arabella. I would do anything for you. Even if you never forgive me. Even if you never want to see me again after tonight. I will still spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. The words hung in the cold air between them, stark and honest and terrifying in their sincerity. Arabella didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to throw herself into his arms, to tell him that she loved him too, that she had loved him since that day in the meadow, when he had looked at her like she was worth seeing. But another part, the part that had learned through bitter experience not to trust, not to hope, not to let herself be vulnerable, held back. Let's save my sister first, she said quietly, and then we can talk about the rest. Sebastian nodded, though she saw something like hope kindle in his eyes. That seems fair. They drove on through the darkness, two people suspended between past wounds and future possibilities, racing toward a confrontation that would change everything. Dawn was breaking over the Scottish border when they finally caught up with their quarry. Sebastian had been right about Hertford's likely route. The man was arrogant enough to travel the main roads, confident that no one would pursue him. They found his carriage at Pun, a posting inn just south of Gretna, the horses being changed while Hertford lounged inside, doubtless congratulating himself on his imminent victory. Catherine was with him. Through the carriage window, Arabella could see her sister's face, pale, exhausted, but still wearing the expression of a woman who believed she was living a romantic adventure rather than a disaster. "Wait here," Sebastian said, handing Arabella down from the curricle. "Let me speak to Hertford first. If I can convince him to release your sister without a scene—" "No." Arabella's voice was flat. "I'm coming with you. Arabella, she's my sister. I'm coming." Sebastian looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him. He nodded once, and together they approached the carriage. Hertford looked up as they approached, and Arabella had the satisfaction of watching his handsome face drain of colour. He recognized Sebastian immediately. The Duke of Thornwood was not a man one forgot, and his eyes darted quickly to the exits, calculating escape routes. "Your Grace," he recovered quickly, his voice smooth despite the fear in his eyes. "What an unexpected pleasure. I didn't realize you were traveling north." "Save your charm, Hertford. It won't work on me." Sebastian's voice was ice, not the awkward reserve Arabella knew, but the cold authority of a duke who expected to be obeyed. "You know why I'm here. I'm sure I don't. Catherine. Arabella pushed past Sebastian, reaching for her sister's hand. Come with me. Now. Catherine's expression cycled through confusion, surprise, and something that looked almost like relief before settling into stubborn defiance. Arabella, what are you doing here? How did you— That doesn't matter. What matters is that you're making a terrible mistake. This man is not who he claims to be. He was stripped of his title for ruining a young woman in London, and you are not the first innocent he has targeted with false promises of marriage. That's a lie. But doubt had crept into Catherine's voice. Richard, tell her it's not true. Tell her it's true. Sebastian spoke over her, his attention fixed on Hertford. Every word of it. And I have letters from no fewer than 3 families who will testify to this man's character or lack thereof. If you proceed with this elopement, Miss Catherine, you will find yourself abandoned and ruined before the month is out. Hertford has no estate in Hampshire. He has no fortune. He has nothing but debts and a talent for deceiving young women who deserve better. Catherine's face had gone very white. She looked between Sebastian and Hertford, searching for some denial, some explanation that would restore her fairy tale. Hertford, apparently realizing that his game was up, dropped all pretense of charm. His handsome face twisted into something ugly. Fine. She's not worth the trouble anyway, a penniless little nobody with nothing to recommend her but a pretty face. I thought her family might have something hidden away, some secret fund or valuable connections, but there's nothing. She's exactly what she appears to be, worthless. Catherine made a small, wounded sound. Arabella saw red. Before she fully realized what she was doing, she had crossed the distance between them and slapped Hertford across the face with all the force she could muster. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed across the inn-yard. "My sister," she said, her voice shaking with fury, "is worth more than 100 men like you. She is kind and hopeful and brave, and if she made the mistake of believing your lies, the fault is yours, not hers. You are the worthless one, Hertford. You prey on innocent women because you are too pathetic to earn an honest living or attract a woman who knows what you truly are. And if I ever see you near my family again, I will make it my life's work to destroy what little remains of your reputation." Hertford stared at her, hand pressed to his reddening cheek, too shocked to respond. Sebastian stepped forward, placing himself between Arabella and the carriage. "I think you should leave, Hertford. Quickly, before I decide to handle this in a less civilized manner." For a moment, something ugly flickered in Hertford's eyes, the look of a man calculating whether he could salvage something from the wreckage. Then he glanced at Sebastian's expression, at the barely leashed violence in the Duke's stance, and apparently decided that retreat was the wiser option. "Keep her," he spat. "Keep all of them. I hope they drain you dry." He pushed past them, shouting for a horse, and within minutes he was gone, riding away down the road as if demons pursued him. In the silence he left behind, Catherine began to cry. The journey home was slower than the journey north. Sebastian had arranged rooms at the inn for them to rest before beginning the return trip. Catherine had cried herself into exhaustion and was sleeping now, her face still blotched and swollen from tears, while Arabella sat beside her bed and tried to sort through the chaos of her own emotions. Relief, first and foremost. Catherine was safe. The elopement had been stopped. Hertford was gone, and while the experience would leave scars, those scars would heal in time. But beneath the relief were other feelings, more complicated and harder to name. A soft knock came at the door. Arabella rose to answer it and found Sebastian in the hallway, looking nearly as exhausted as she felt. "I wanted to check on you," he said quietly. "Both of you." "Catherine is sleeping. She'll be all right, I think, once she's had time to recover." Arabella stepped into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. "Thank you. For everything. If you hadn't helped us—" You would have found another way. You're the most resourceful person I've ever met. Perhaps. But your way was faster. And your presence, the way Hartford looked at you, I don't think he would have given up so easily if— You hadn't been there? Sebastian shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I'm glad I could help. They stood in the dim hallway, the silence stretching between them. Arabella thought of everything that had happened over the past weeks. The deception, the revelation, the anger, and now this. She thought of the man who had walked with her through meadows and argued about philosophy, and she thought of the Duke who had driven through the night to help save her sister. They were the same person. She understood that now. In the carriage, she said slowly, you said you loved me. Sebastian went very still. I did. Did you mean it? Every word. I have loved you since the day we met, when you told me off for startling you, and then proceeded to argue with me about the moral failures of the aristocracy while I carried you home. A faint smile touched his lips. I knew then that I would never meet anyone like you. I know now that I was right. Arabella's heart was pounding. She thought of all the reasons she should be careful, should hold back, should protect herself from the vulnerability of loving someone who could hurt her. Then she thought of the way Sebastian looked at her, as if she were worth seeing, worth knowing, worth loving despite all her sharp edges and defensive walls. She thought of the way he listened to her, challenged her, treated her as an equal. She thought of the night they had just shared, driving through darkness together, fighting for someone they both cared about. Trust was a risk. Love was a risk. But living without either was its own kind of death. I was so angry with you, she said. For weeks, all I could feel was anger and betrayal. You lied to me, and I had sworn I would never let anyone lie to me again. I know, Let me finish. She took a breath. I was angry, but underneath the anger there was something else. Something I tried very hard not to feel, because feeling it meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant being hurt. I spent so many years building walls around my heart, protecting myself from disappointment and loss. And then you came along and made me want to tear them down. Sebastian was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. I can't promise that I trust you completely, she continued. I can't promise that the wounds have healed overnight. But I can promise that I am willing to try. I am willing to let you prove that you are the man I thought you were, the man I hoped you were, before I learned the truth about your title. And if I can prove it— Arabella stepped closer, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in his grey eyes. Then perhaps we can discuss what comes next. Together. Sebastian reached out slowly and took her hand. She let him. I will spend the rest of my life proving it, he said quietly. Whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. You are worth any amount of patience, any amount of time, any amount of proving. I love you, Arabella Thorne, and I will wait for you. She looked at him, this man who had deceived her and saved her, who infuriated her and moved her, who saw her in a way no one else ever had. I don't know if I love you yet, she said honestly, but I think I could. I think I might already, and I'm just too stubborn to admit it. Sebastian laughed, a soft exhale of relief and joy. That sounds very much like you. I suppose it does. They stood there in the hallway, hands intertwined, on the threshold of something neither of them fully understood. Behind them, Catherine slept off the worst night of her young life. Ahead of them lay the long journey home, and all the complications that would come with it, explaining the situation to their families, weathering the gossip, building something real from the rubble of deception and misunderstanding. But for this moment, none of that mattered. We should rest, Sebastian said finally. Tomorrow will be long. Yes, Arabella squeezed his hand once before releasing it. "Tomorrow will be long." She turned back toward Catherine's room, but paused at the doorway. "Sebastian?" "Yes?" "Thank you for being the man who came after us, the man who helped save my sister when he had no obligation to do so. Whatever else is uncertain between us, I know that man is real, and I am grateful for him." Sebastian's smile was soft and genuine and full of things he did not need to say. "Good night, Arabella." "Good night, Sebastian." She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart full of something that felt dangerously like hope. Outside, she heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, and then silence. Tomorrow, they would face the world. Tomorrow they would navigate the complicated terrain of rebuilding trust and discovering whether love could grow from such troubled soil. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Arabella allowed herself to believe that perhaps everything would be all right. The return to Thornwood was both simpler and more complicated than Arabella had anticipated. Simpler because Sebastian handled the practical matters with quiet efficiency. He arranged for a comfortable carriage to replace the racing curricle, ensuring that Catherine could travel in privacy and relative comfort. He sent a messenger ahead to Hartwell Manor to inform the family that the crisis had been resolved and both sisters were safe. He managed the coaching inns and the horses and the countless small details of travel, leaving Arabella free to focus on her sister. More complicated, because Catherine's recovery was not the straightforward matter Arabella had hoped it would be. For the first day of travel, Catherine barely spoke. She sat in the corner of the carriage, wrapped in a blanket despite the summer warmth, staring out the window at the passing countryside with eyes that saw nothing. When she did speak, it was only to apologize endlessly, tearfully, for the trouble she had caused, for believing Hartford's lies, for being so foolish and so naive and so desperately, pathetically hopeful. "I thought he loved me," she whispered on the second afternoon, when they had stopped at an inn for refreshment. "I really thought he loved me. He said all the right things. He looked at me like I was precious, and I wanted so badly to believe it that I ignored everything else." "You're not the first woman to be deceived by a practiced liar," Arabella said gently. "And you won't be the last. What matters is that you're safe now." "Am I?" Catherine's laugh was bitter, nothing like her usual bright sound. "My reputation is ruined. Everyone will know what happened, that I tried to elope with a man who was only using me. No respectable man will ever want me now." "That's not true." "It is true, and you know it. This is how it works. A man can ruin a dozen women and still be received in society, but let a woman make one mistake, and she's marked forever." Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks. "I've destroyed myself, Arabella. I've destroyed my chances at any kind of future. And for what? For a man who never cared about me at all." Arabella had no easy answer, because Catherine was not entirely wrong. Society was cruel to women who strayed from the narrow path of respectability, and the story of an attempted elopement would spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. There would be whispers, sideways glances, invitations that mysteriously ceased to arrive. But there was also Sebastian, who had been remarkably thoughtful about protecting Catherine's reputation. He had arranged their travel to minimize exposure, avoided busy coaching inns where they might be recognized, and mentioned that he intended to put about a story explaining their absence from the neighborhood in innocent terms. "The Duke is helping," Arabella said carefully. "He believes your reputation can be salvaged if we're careful about how the story is told." Catherine looked up, surprise momentarily breaking through her despair. "The Duke? Why would he help me? He doesn't even know me." "Because he loves your sister," Arabella thought, but did not say. "Because he is a better man than I gave him credit for." "He's a good person," she said instead. "And he feels responsible, since he knew Hartford's true nature and tried to warn us." "You mean, tried to warn you?" Catherine's voice was hollow. "I remember. You tried to tell me, and I accused you of jealousy. I said terrible things to you, Arabella. I said you wanted me to be miserable like you." "You were in love. People in love say foolish things. That doesn't make it right." Catherine reached out and took her sister's hand. "You've spent your whole life taking care of us, Mamma and Violet and me, and we've never properly appreciated it. You gave up your own chances to keep our family together, and I repaid you by running off with the first man who paid me a compliment. I'm so sorry. There's nothing to forgive. There's everything to forgive, but I'm going to try to deserve your forgiveness." "Anyway." Catherine squared her shoulders, something of her old determination returning. "When we get home, I'm going to stop dreaming about fairy tales and start being useful. I'm going to help you, the way you've always helped us. I'm going to be better." Arabella squeezed her sister's hand, hope kindling in her chest. Catherine had been wounded, but she was not broken. Given time and support, she would recover. She might even emerge stronger for the experience, the way metal was strengthened by fire. "You already are better," Arabella said. "You just didn't know it yet." Their arrival at Hartwell Manor was less dramatic than Arabella had feared. Sebastian's messenger had done his work well. Cousin Harriet was prepared with a cover story that Catherine had been called away suddenly to attend a sick friend, with Arabella accompanying her as chaperone. It was thin, but it would hold if no one looked too closely. Their mother, predictably, was more concerned with her own distress than with questioning the narrative. "How could you do this to me?" she wailed when Catherine appeared. "The worry, the fear, not knowing if you were alive or dead. I'm sorry, Mamma." Catherine's voice was flat with exhaustion. "I made a terrible mistake. It won't happen again." "It had better not. If word gets out about this, if anyone learns what really happened—" "No one will learn," Cousin Harriet interrupted firmly, "because we are all going to agree on what happened, and we are all going to stick to that story." Catherine visited a sick friend. Arabella accompanied her. The Duke of Thornwood happened to be travelling in the same direction, and kindly offered his assistance when their carriage broke down. That is what happened. That is what will be said. Am I understood? Her tone brooked no argument. For all her penny-pinching and pointed comments about poor relations, Cousin Harriet apparently drew the line at allowing family scandals to reach public ears. Arabella felt an unexpected surge of gratitude toward the iron-spined widow. "What about the Viscount?" Violet asked quietly. She had been hovering in the doorway, watching the reunion with worried eyes. "Won't he talk?" "The Viscount has been encouraged to leave the area immediately and permanently." Sebastian spoke for the first time since entering the house. "I made it very clear that if any rumours about Miss Catherine reach my ears, I will personally ensure that his already tarnished reputation is destroyed beyond any hope of recovery." He understood me. There was steel in his voice, the steel of a duke who expected to be obeyed. Arabella remembered Hertford's face when Sebastian confronted him at the inn, the fear that had flickered in those calculating eyes. Whatever Sebastian had said or implied, it had been effective. Hertford would not trouble them again. "Well," Cousin Harriet looked at Sebastian with something approaching respect. "It seems we owe your grace a considerable debt." "You owe me nothing. I simply did what any decent person would do." "Few decent people have the power to silence a man like Hertford. Fewer still would use that power on behalf of a family with nothing to offer in return." She paused, her sharp gaze moving between Sebastian and Arabella in a way that suggested she saw more than she was saying. "You have our gratitude, Your Grace, if there is ever anything we can do to repay your kindness." "There is one thing." Sebastian glanced at Arabella, something vulnerable flickering beneath his composure. I would like permission to call on Miss Thorne, properly, if she is willing to receive me." The room went very still. Arabella felt every eye turned toward her, her mother's suddenly calculating, Catherine's surprised, Violet's quietly hopeful, cousin Harriet's assessing. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the significance of what Sebastian was asking. He was asking to court her, publicly. The Duke of Thornwood, one of the most eligible men in England, was asking permission to pay formal addresses to a penniless nobody whose family was one scandal away from complete ruin. It was insane. It was impossible. It was everything she had sworn she would never want. And yet— "I am willing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If your Grace wishes to call, I would be pleased to receive you." Sebastian's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then I shall call tomorrow, if that is convenient." "Perfectly convenient." They stood there, smiling at each other like fools, while the rest of the room dissolved into excited whispers and pointed questions, and the particular chaos that accompanied any romantic development in a household of women. Arabella barely noticed. All she could see was Sebastian's face, and the promise in his eyes, and the future that suddenly seemed possible in ways it never had before. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Arabella had imagined. She had expected Sebastian to be awkward in the formal rituals of calling and chaperoned visits, and he was, sometimes, stumbling over the prescribed pleasantries and looking desperately relieved when they were allowed to escape into actual conversation. But he was also sincere in a way that no other suitor in her limited experience had ever been. He didn't flatter or dissemble or say what he thought she wanted to hear. He was simply himself, and he invited her to be simply herself in return. They walked through the village together, stopping to greet the tenants and tradespeople who waved cheerfully at their duke. Sebastian knew all their names, asked after their children and their crops and their ailments, listened to their concerns with genuine attention. Arabella watched him and saw at last the man his tenants had always known, not the awkward recluse of society gossip, but a landlord who cared deeply for the people in his charge. They argued about books in the lending library, their debates drawing amused glances from other patrons. Sebastian had read everything, it seemed, and held strong opinions about all of it. He challenged her assumptions and made her defend her positions, treating her intelligence as something to be enjoyed rather than endured. They sat in Thornwood Hall's magnificent library, surrounded by thousands of volumes accumulated over generations, and talked about their families. Sebastian told her about Marcus, the golden brother who had been everything Sebastian was not, charming and confident and born to lead. He told her about the accident, the terrible messenger who had arrived with news that changed everything, the funeral where everyone looked at him with pity and expectation in equal measure. "I wanted to run," he admitted, staring into the fire. "I wanted to disappear, to let the title pass to some distant cousin, to go back to being the second son no one noticed. But there was no one else, no cousin close enough, no other heir who could take my place. So I stayed, and I tried to become what everyone needed me to be, and I failed in 1,000 small ways every single day." "You didn't fail." Arabella's voice was firm. "Your tenants adore you. Your estate flourishes. The people who actually know you, not the gossips in London, but the ones who see you every day, they speak of you with genuine respect and affection. They're kind. They're honest. Country people have no use for flattery." She reached out and took his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "You are a good duke, Sebastian. Not a perfect one. No one is perfect, but a good one. Your brother would be proud." Sebastian's fingers tightened around hers. "You didn't know my brother. No, but I know you, and I know that any brother worth the title would be proud of the man you've become." He didn't answer, but he didn't release her hand either. They sat there in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly, and Arabella felt something shift between them, a deepening, a settling, as if they were finally finding their way to solid ground after weeks of uncertain terrain. Summer ripened toward autumn, and the courtship continued. Arabella's family situation improved gradually. Sebastian had quietly arranged for Catherine to be invited to a house party hosted by his aunt, the Dowager Countess of Ashworth, a formidable woman who had the power to make or break reputations with a single raised eyebrow. The invitation was a signal to society that the Duke's family sanctioned Catherine Thorne, and no one who valued their social standing would dare contradict the Dowager Countess. Catherine returned from the house party with colour in her cheeks and a steadiness in her eyes that Arabella had not seen in years. She had met people. She reported sensible people who judged her by her conversation rather than her circumstances. She had even attracted the attention of a young baronet, a quiet man with a modest estate and a genuine smile. "I'm not getting my hopes up," Thrin said, but she was smiling as she said it. "I've learned that lesson, at least. But he's kind, Arabella. Truly kind, not just charming. And he knows about what happened, and he doesn't care. He says everyone makes mistakes, and the measure of a person is how they learn from them. He sounds wise. He is. He's not dashing or exciting, but I've had enough of dashing and exciting. I want someone steady, someone I can trust." Arabella thought of Sebastian, who was not dashing in the traditional sense, but who made her laugh and challenged her mind and had driven through the night to help save her sister. Sebastian, who was steady and trustworthy and everything she had never dared to hope for. "I think," she said carefully, "that steady and trustworthy are underrated qualities." Catherine's smile turned knowing. "Speaking from experience, are we?" "Perhaps. The Duke adores you. Everyone can see it. He looks at you like you're the only person in the room, even when the room is full of people. It's almost embarrassing, really. It is not embarrassing. It's a little embarrassing, but also wonderful." Catherine reached out and squeezed her sister's hand. "You deserve this, Arabella. After everything you've done for us, after all the years of sacrifice and managing and holding us together, you deserve someone who sees how extraordinary you are." Arabella blinked back unexpected tears. "When did you become so wise?" "Probably around the time I made the worst mistake of my life, and you forgave me anyway. Nearly being ruined by a fortune hunter is very educational." Catherine's tone was light, but her eyes were serious. "Don't let fear hold you back. Sebastian loves you. And if I'm not mistaken, which I'm not, because I have become an expert in recognizing genuine emotion, you love him too." Arabella stopped, considered, and made herself be honest. "Yes, I do. I love him." It was the first time she had said the words aloud, and they felt strange in her mouth, vulnerable and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She loved Sebastian Ashworth, Duke of Thornwood. She loved his grey eyes and his dry humour, and the way he listened to her as if every word she spoke mattered. She loved his kindness to his tenants and his loyalty to his family, and the quiet determination with which he tried to be better than he believed himself capable of being. She loved him, and she was ready to tell him so. The opportunity came on a golden September afternoon. Sebastian had invited her to walk in the grounds of Thornwood Hall, a path they had taken many times before. But this time he seemed different, nervous, in a way she hadn't seen since the early days of their acquaintance, when he had been hiding his identity and she had been fighting her attraction to him. They walked in silence for a while, through the formal gardens and into the wilder parkland beyond. The trees were just beginning to turn, hints of gold and crimson appearing among the green. And these air smelled of approaching autumn, rich and earthy, and tinged with the sweetness of ripe fruit. "I brought you here for a reason," Sebastian said finally, stopping beneath an ancient oak whose spreading branches created a canopy overhead. "This was my favorite place as a child. Marcus and I used to climb this tree and pretend we were pirates surveying the seas. I needed you to see it." "It's beautiful," Arabella said, and meant it. "I've been thinking about the future." Sebastian turned to face her, his expression serious. "About what I want, and what I hope for, and whether I have any right to ask for it. You can ask me anything." "Can I?" He reached out and took her hands, holding them gently between his own. "Because what I want to ask is significant, life-changing, and I need you to know that if your answer is no, I will accept it and never speak of it again. Your friendship means too much to me to risk losing it by pushing too hard." Arabella's heart was beating very fast. "Sebastian, let me say this. Please." He took a breath, visibly gathering himself. "I love you, Arabella Thorne. I have loved you since the day we met, and my love has only grown deeper with every day since. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, brilliant and brave and kind and fierce, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else. I don't deserve you. I know I don't deserve you. But I am selfish enough to ask anyway." He released one of her hands and reached into his coat, producing a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" He opened the box to reveal a ring, not the ostentatious diamond she might have expected from a duke, but a beautiful, understated piece featuring a warm golden stone surrounded by smaller gems that caught the afternoon light. "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "She was not born to aristocracy. She was the daughter of a country gentleman, and my grandfather scandalized his family by marrying her. They said he was throwing himself away on someone beneath him, but they loved each other for 40 years, and by all accounts their marriage was the happiest anyone in my family has ever known. I hoped—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "If you don't like it, I can get something else. Something more suitable for a duchess." "It's perfect." Arabella's voice came out thick with emotion. "It's absolutely perfect." Does that mean—" "Yes." She laughed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you. I love you. I love you so much it terrifies me, because I spent so long believing I would never love anyone, and now I can't imagine not loving you. I want to spend my life arguing with you about philosophy and walking through meadows and building something together. I want to be your duchess and your partner and your friend. I want everything, and I want it with you." Sebastian's face transformed with joy. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, with all the passion and tenderness and desperate hope that words could not express. The kiss went on for a long time. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing and crying at once, the sun had moved lower in the sky, and the shadows had lengthened around them. "I should warn you," Arabella said, "that I am not the sort of duchess who will host elaborate parties and charm society into submission. I am opinionated and sharp-tongued, and I will probably offend half the ton within a month of our marriage. I'm counting on it. The ton is terribly boring and could use some offending. I'm serious, Sebastian. I don't know how to be what they expect. I don't know how to be gracious and accommodating and—" He kissed her again, silencing her protests. "I don't want you to be anything other than what you are," he said when he pulled back. "I fell in love with your sharp tongue and your opinions and your complete unwillingness to be gracious when you don't feel like it. I don't need a conventional duchess. I need you. You may regret that. Never." He pressed his forehead to hers, grey eyes meeting brown. "Never, Arabella, not for a single moment. I will spend the rest of my life thanking whatever providence sent you tumbling into that rabbit hole and into my life." Arabella laughed, remembering that day, the twisted ankle, the irritation, the stranger who had refused to leave her stranded. She had been so determined to dislike him, to maintain her walls against a man she assumed was just another privileged fool. How wrong she had been. How wonderfully, gloriously wrong. "I love you," she said again, because she could now, because the words no longer frightened her. "I love you, Sebastian Ashworth, Duke of Thornwood, an arguer about philosophy and finder of women in meadows. And I love you, Arabella Thorne, soon to be Duchess of Thornwood, and challenger of assumptions, and woman who swore she would never marry a duke. I did say that, didn't I? Frequently, and with great conviction. Well," she smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting, "I suppose I shall have to eat my words. I shall remind you of them regularly. It's important to maintain humility." She laughed and kissed him again, and the oak tree that had sheltered generations of Ashworths spread its branches over them like a blessing as they sealed their promise beneath its golden leaves. The wedding took place in the village church on a crisp October morning, with half the county in attendance and the other half wishing they had been invited. Arabella wore a gown of ivory silk that she had helped design herself, with clean lines and minimal embellishment, elegant rather than ostentatious, befitting a bride who valued substance over show. Catherine served as her attendant, radiant in soft blue, with her steadfast baronet watching from the front pews. Violet sat beside their mother, who was for once too overcome with emotion to complain about anything. Sebastian waited at the altar, looking simultaneously terrified and ecstatic. He had been sick with nerves all morning, according to his valet's amused report, convinced that something would go wrong, that Arabella would change her mind, that he would somehow prove himself unworthy at the last moment. But when she appeared at the church doors, his face cleared like the sky after a storm. He watched her walk toward him, with an expression of such naked adoration that several guests were observed dabbing at their eyes. The ceremony was brief and beautiful, the ancient words taking on new meaning, as they were spoken by two people who had fought their way to this moment through deception and forgiveness, through anger and understanding, through all the complicated terrain of falling in love against one's better judgment. "I, Sebastian," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "take thee, Arabella, to be my wedded wife." "I, Arabella," she replied, and her voice did not tremble at all. "Take thee, Sebastian, to be my wedded husband." The ring slid onto her finger beside his grandmother's engagement ring. The vicar pronounced them man and wife, and when Sebastian kissed her, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers that echoed off the ancient stone walls. They emerged from the church into brilliant autumn sunshine, the village green lined with tenants and tradespeople who had come to celebrate their duke's wedding. Children threw flower petals, and old women waved handkerchiefs, and somewhere a fiddle struck up a merry tune. "Your people love you," Arabella murmured as they walked through the crowd, nodding and smiling at the well-wishers. "Our people," Sebastian corrected. "They're your people now too. Our people, our home, our life." The words settled into Arabella's heart like seeds taking root, the beginning of something that would grow and flourish for years to come. The wedding breakfast at Thornwood Hall was magnificent, but Arabella barely noticed the food or the flowers, or the endless parade of congratulations. She was too busy watching Sebastian, her husband, her duke, her partner in everything, as he moved through the celebration with a grace she had never seen in him before. He was not the awkward recluse of his reputation. Not today. He was a man transformed by happiness, lit from within by a joy that made him almost unrecognizable. He laughed with his tenants and charmed the local gentry, and danced with every elderly widow in the room, all while sending Arabella glances across the crowded space that made her pulse race. Later, much later, when the guests had finally departed and the house had quieted into nighttime stillness, they stood together on the terrace where they had argued so bitterly the night of the midsummer ball. "It seems like a lifetime ago," Sebastian said, reading her thoughts. "Standing here, watching you walk away from me, certain I had destroyed any chance of this." "I was so angry," Arabella admitted. "So hurt. I felt like such a fool for believing in you. And now? Now I know that I wasn't a fool. I believed in the real you, the man beneath the title. The deception was only in the details." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close against his chest. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve your faith in me. You already deserve it. You proved it, that night when you drove through darkness to help save my sister, when you asked for nothing in return except the chance to earn my trust. I would have done anything for that chance. I know." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "I know, Sebastian. That's why I love you." They stood there as the moon rose over the grounds of Thornwood Hall, two people who had found each other against all odds and fought through obstacles, both external and internal, to reach this moment. Behind them, the great house waited their home now, filled with possibilities they would explore together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be London to face, with all its gossip and scrutiny. There would be the ongoing work of managing an estate and supporting tenants through hard seasons and good. There would be family to nurture Catherine's continued recovery, Violet's launch into society, their mother's endless needs. But tonight, there was only this. Two people who had chosen each other, standing on the threshold of a shared future, ready to build something neither had dared to dream of alone. "Come inside," Sebastian murmured. "It's getting cold." In a moment. Arabella looked out at the moonlit gardens, at the meadow in the distance where they had first met. "I want to remember this, the feeling of being exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly who I'm supposed to be with. You can feel that any time. I intend to make sure of it." She smiled. "I know you will." They turned and walked inside together, hand in hand, leaving the terrace to the moonlight and the ghosts of all the conversations they had needed to have before they could reach this peace. 8 years later. The meadow had not changed. Arabella sat on a blanket beneath the summer sun, watching her children play, while their father demonstrated with perhaps excessive dramatic flair how to properly duel with wooden swords. Henry, the eldest at 7, was taking the lesson very seriously, his small face set in concentration as he parried and thrust. Elizabeth, 5 years old and entirely unwilling to be left out, had armed herself with a stick and was attempting to attack her father from behind. And little Marcus, just turned 2, was more interested in the daisies than the sword fight, carefully picking them one by one and depositing them in a pile that he seemed to consider a significant achievement. "Papa is losing," Henry announced with satisfaction as Sebastian staggered backward, hand pressed to his chest in theatrical agony. "Your father is letting you—" "Win," Arabella called. "Don't let it go to your head." "I am mortally wounded." Sebastian collapsed onto the grass with a groan that made Elizabeth giggle. "Tell your mother I loved her." "Mamma, Papa says he loves you." "Tell your father I know." The children laughed and piled onto Sebastian, who bore the assault with the patience of a man long accustomed to serving as a human climbing frame. Arabella watched them, with a heart so full it almost hurt this family she had never expected to have, this happiness she had never dared to imagine. A carriage appeared on the distant road, and she shaded her eyes to watch its approach. Catherine and her husband, Sir Thomas Belmont, arriving for their annual summer visit with their 3 children. Later in the week, Violet would come with her clergyman husband and their new baby, the first grandchild, a development that had reduced Mrs. Thorne to happy tears for days. Her mother lived in the Dowager cottage at the edge of the estate now, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to maintain everyone's sanity. She complained, of course, about the weather, about her joints, about the way modern children were allowed to run wild, but her complaints had lost their bitter edge. She was content in her way. She had lived to see all 3 daughters well married, and if she occasionally mentioned that she had always known the Duke would come to his senses, no one bothered to contradict her. Sebastian extracted himself from the pile of children and came to join Arabella on the blanket, grass in his hair and a smear of dirt across his cheek. "I have been defeated," he announced. "Our son is a formidable warrior. He has an excellent teacher. He has a teacher who lets him win, because those little eyes get very sad when he loses." Sebastian stretched out beside her, propping himself on one elbow. "Is that Catherine's carriage?" "I believe so." "Then I should go make myself presentable. Thomas will never let me hear the end of it if he arrives to find the Duke of Thornwood looking like he's been wrestling in the hay. You have been wrestling in the hay, with people a quarter of your size, which makes my defeat even more embarrassing." But he made no move to get up, content to lie in the summer warmth and watch his children play. "Are you happy, Arabella?" It was a question he asked often, as if he still couldn't quite believe that this life was real, that the sharp-tongued woman who had sworn never to marry a duke was now Duchess of Thornwood, mother of his children, partner in everything that mattered. Arabella looked at him, at the grey hair beginning to show at his temples, at the lines around his eyes that came from years of laughter, at the face she loved more with every passing day. "I once swore I would never marry a duke," she said. "I recall. You were very emphatic about it. I was wrong. You were gloriously, wonderfully wrong. It was the wisest wrong decision I ever made." She leaned over and kissed him, tasting summer and happiness and home. "Yes, Sebastian, I am happy. I am happier than I ever imagined I could be." He smiled, and she saw in that smile everything they had built together, the trust that had grown from deception, the love that had grown from anger, the life that had grown from 2 people brave enough to give each other a second chance. "Good," he said, "because I intend to keep making you happy for a very long time." "How long?" "Forever, if you'll let me." She kissed him again, longer this time, until Elizabeth's voice interrupted with theatrical disgust. "Papa is kissing Mamma again." "Your father kisses your mother because he loves her," Sebastian called back, "and because she is the most extraordinary woman in England, and he is very lucky she agreed to marry him." "That's what you always say, because it's always true." Arabella laughed, leaning into her husband's shoulder as their children resumed their games, and the carriage drew closer, and the future stretched before them, bright and full of promise. She had married a duke. Not just any duke, this duke, who had seen past her walls and loved her anyway, who had proven himself worthy of her trust through years of partnership and devotion. She did not regret a moment of it. This was their life. This was their happiness. This was their forever. And somewhere in the meadow where it had all begun, the rabbit hole that had twisted her ankle and changed her destiny, remained a small, unassuming dip in the earth that had led to everything that came after. She would never fill it in. It was the best thing that had ever happened to her.